with Republicans now in control, are the days numbered for organized labor as we currently know it here in New Hampshire? We have opposing viewpoints this morning. Greg Moore, State Director of Americans Prosperity, and Mark McKenzie, former head of the AFL-CIO in New Hampshire, but now a state rep, but still obviously very much opposed to right-to-work legislation. So, Mark, let's start with you. Only way it would seem to stop this from happening is you're going to have to win over some Republicans. So how are you going to do it?
That's right, and I think that there's a significant effort underway to do that. There's meetings, district meetings that are taking place all throughout the state. We're talking to them. We're trying to explain to them why this is not the right thing for the state of New Hampshire, and I think that we're making some progress.
No, they're hearing a lot of people within their own caucus tell them why it is the right thing. So how do you make your case?
Well, I think the way we make our case is that right to work is one factor in economic development, not necessarily in New Hampshire because it hasn't really raised its head. But really what the things that really are affecting the economy in the state of New Hampshire, and inability to attract business, relates to high energy costs and low unemployment. The workforce issue is an enormous thing. And then finally, just access to capital. The fact is that most people don't, in New Hampshire, don't have that kind of access. And you compare it, and we'll hear, I think, more about North Carolina and other places that have right-to-work laws. They're in a much different place. And if New Hampshire wants to compete on that level, New Hampshire has to change the way that they go to attract business. Right-to-work is not the way to do it.
And Greg, you think right-to-work does attract business?
Well, absolutely. And particularly if you look at the states that have become right-to-work states in the last 5 years. Now, I mean, it's difficult to compare, say, Connecticut with Alabama. But I think what's important to look at is what would New Hampshire experience if right-to-work passed here. Fundamentally, what it would help is not just with job growth, but job growth particularly in the manufacturing sector. 75% of new manufacturing jobs since 2009 have gone to right-to-work states. In fact, we saw the largest employer in Sullivan County say that they would not even consider moving, when they expanded, they would not even consider moving to a state that didn't have a right-to-work law. So they went to North Carolina and brought 1,200 jobs there. But bringing manufacturing jobs to New Hampshire is critical because we've seen a free fall in that area of our economy. And the 2000 census said that we had 93,000 manufacturing jobs in New Hampshire. According to the New Hampshire Department of Employment Security data from last week, that number has fallen to 67,000. So we've lost 30% of our manufacturing jobs here in New Hampshire. And those are important because according to the National Association of Manufacturers, the average compensation for a New Hampshire manufacturing job is $75,000. So those are good jobs. And if we want to have a chance to compete for those jobs, we have to pass right to work, and as well as a number of other factors. We have to continue to provide more tax relief for businesses and start working on our energy costs.
So Mark, a lot of these businesses that do move to right-to-work states do so, theoretically, to avoid the headaches that come along with unions.
You know, that's not the case. You cited Sturm Ruger out of the Newport area. So they've been using temp workers for a long period of time. The real difference for them, the real thing that made the difference, was that they wagged $12 million+ in the face to draw them to North Carolina. Plus, they also went into an area with very high unemployment, over 10% unemployment in their area. So there is a workforce that is available. New Hampshire, we have almost, structurally, we have no unemployment in the state of New Hampshire. The problem is not, the reason people are moving is they can't find the workers to do the job. Any meeting that you go into with business today, that's what they'll tell you.
Greg, we have the lowest unemployment in the country. And people, I mean, there's a consensus that we need to bring more businesses here. But this is a significant overhaul. If something's not broken.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that we do have a workforce problem in New Hampshire. That's 106,000 people get up every day and travel out of the state. Most of them go to Massachusetts, 84,000 people every day. Look, you just need to look at 93 and 95 every morning to see the people leaving New Hampshire and going to Massachusetts. We want to keep those jobs here. We want to keep those jobs here and growing the economy here. And fundamentally, I think it's mostly critical that we give businesses every opportunity. We made a huge step forward 2 years ago by providing some tax relief that started January 1st of last year. Our economy exploded after that. We have the opportunity to have the same sort of dynamic take place here. And then, but when we passed those business tax cuts, one of the things that happened is some people actually had a chance to stop working in Massachusetts and come back and work in New Hampshire. And that's what we want to continue to do. We want to sort of flip the script so that 93 in the morning is busy going the other way.
Well, let me just respond to that. Massachusetts is not a right-to-work state. And quite frankly, those 109,000 people that are traveling into Massachusetts is not a right-to-work state. What they've been effective in doing is attracting business because they have the capital necessary. The venture capital market in Massachusetts explodes. People need capital, and they need workforce that need capital. Let me just say one other thing that we need in the state of New Hampshire, and I would like to hear Greg's opinion on it. What about the infrastructure issues, and what about the idea of rail service and other things would give people access to New Hampshire opportunities? We're not anywhere close to passing those kinds of things. You need good infrastructure, you need good workers, you need access to capital, and you also need innovative ways to attract new workers in the state.
Yeah, I don't want to stray too far away from the original topic of right to work, but weigh in here, because it does need to be a multi-pronged effort to sustainability.
Absolutely. Right to work is one component of a long list of things that New Hampshire needs to do to be as competitive as possible. We need to give ourselves the opportunity to move the ball in a whole host of different areas, and we're working on those here at AFP, whether it's lowering energy costs. But I think it's also important to understand that right to work also gives workers freedom, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. In 2006, I was working as a director at the Department of Health and Human Services when non-union state employees suddenly had to start paying the union, and I sat with then Commissioner John Stephen, and we sat down with a number of these employees who are very frustrated about the fact that they weren't happy with the bargain that the union got for them for their deal. They weren't happy with the services that they were getting. They frankly wanted nothing to do with the union, and suddenly they had to start paying the union that they wanted nothing to do with. And I think there's a similarity there. You had two choices for those workers. You can either join a union that you're not comfortable with, or you could pay a fee for the privilege of not joining the union. There's a very strong similarity to what we saw with the individual mandate under Obamacare, where you had two choices. You could either buy a health care plan you didn't want, or you could pay a fee called a shared responsibility payment for the privilege of not buying health insurance. And there's a reason why that was durably the most unpopular component of Obamacare. And it's the same reason why right to work scores so well as far as public opinion polls. It's because Americans simply don't believe that you should be forced to buy a good or a service you don't want.
Now, a lot of people do believe, Mark, especially the detractors, that this is more about money than anything else and keeping the union bosses happy. I mean, how do you make the case?
Well,
I mean, are unions evolving to the point? I mean, you've been on both sides of this thing. You're a legislator now. Are we seeing, do you expect to see the same type of visibility in the case being made as we had in previous years when there's a Democratic governor showcasing what unions do today, not in the 20s when, you had the sweatshops?
Right. Well, let me just respond real quickly to one of the things that Greg said. In spite of the fact that there are complaints from state employees and other people that they had to pay the fee, there's not one of those people that basically said the deal that was cut by the state employees, a negotiated deal, we're going to refuse to take that money. There's not one person that did that. And in fact, in every instance that we have seen where there are agency fees and workers are complaining as a result of it, there's not one worker I've ever come across that said, we're not going to take the raise, we're not going to take the vacation time, and we're not going to take the kind of benefits that union has negotiated for us. So, that said, I think it's an important point. But really, and I don't think I think when you talk about Obamacare, quite frankly, there are millions of people today that have health insurance that never had it before. And there's not one person, I bet, that would say, I have cancer and I wish we never passed the Obamacare, because I would have rather been uninsured and uncovered by in policies. Because Obamacare was a reason that many people got covered.
Is there any middle ground here when it comes to right to work? I mean, workers, obviously, they deserve to have protections as well, skilled laborers, but this has become such an adversarial relationship for those opposed to right to work in organized labor that I don't know how much talking is going on. Is there?
We were chatting a little bit. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of talking, but I don't think that the way that we're going to solve the problems in the state of New Hampshire in terms of workforce and other things is to attack the people, quite frankly, that are doing the work now, that are providing opportunities for people in decent, really good jobs. When you look at where there are agency fees and other things like that, those are the people who are fighting fires, they're police officers, they're state employees, they are people who are cleaning the roads, they are people who are dealing with the electrical work and building trades and other people like that. Don't attack that workforce. Let's find ways that we can work together that really provide opportunities for people. Let's solve the issue around financing and workforce and education and transportation in New Hampshire.
Greg, I'll give you the final word here, and I do want to point out that there's some talk about public, carving out the public unions, the schools, first responders, things along those lines. What do you think? I mean, is there some room?
Well, I think first and foremost, the best way to make sure that workers are well protected is to have a strong economy. Because when employers really need workers and they can't find them, they're going to do everything they can to take care of them. But I think an important thing to keep in mind is that Right to Work is not anti-union. You look at Indiana, they've added 20,000 union employees since Right to Work passed here. Michigan has increased its private sector union roles by 7%. And I think that there was one instance that really struck me, and that was a case in which one of our top activists works in a union shop, and there were 25 people who were older who were on a regular pension plan, and there were 18 people who were on a 401k plan. And when they went in to bargain, they bargained for more pension benefits, and the 18 people who were on a 401k got nothing. And Right to Work would give them the opportunity to say that if you give us a shaft, we're not going to pay you a nickel for it.
All right, we'll see where this is going, and hopefully the dialogue does continue, but it's up next in the House. Gentlemen, thanks very much. I wish we had more time to go over this, but good to see you this morning.
Sam.
And after the break, we'll talk with the original architect of Donald Trump's national campaign and find out what it was like for him to watch it turn into a presidency. Stay with us.